Welcome. Tonight we're returning to a time when England wasn't ruled by peace, but by petals, red and white ones. This is the story of the War of the Roses, a 30-year struggle where kings lost crowns, cousins became enemies, and the fate of England hung on the thorns of a family feud. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let the past do the talking. If you enjoy drifting off to quiet stories about loud history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. That way you'll never miss another sleepy dive into the strange, slow corners of the past. Now, let's begin. It all started with a family that had too many princes and not enough patience. The mighty Plantagenet dynasty had ruled England for generations, building castles, winning wars, and arguing over who had the better claim to the crown. But by the 1400s, those royal roots had twisted into something darker. Brothers, cousins, and uncles all started eyeing the throne like it was the last seat at the dinner table. The trouble really began with King Edward III, a ruler so successful that he accidentally created generations of ambitious descendants. Edward had 5 sons who survived into adulthood, and each one left behind children who thought their bloodline deserved the throne. When everyone's got a bit of royal blood, nobody wants to admit they're the distant cousin. From Edward's 3rd son came the House of Lancaster, proud, powerful, and fond of wearing red roses on their badges. From his 4th son came the House of York, equally proud and convinced they were the rightful heirs, waving their white rose banner. Red versus white. Lancaster versus York. Roses look peaceful, but this garden was about to get bloody. At first, nobody expected it to explode into decades of war. After all, these were cousins, family. But medieval politics had a nasty habit of turning family dinners into full-blown battlefields. Every wedding, every birth, every whispered rumor about succession added a little more fuel to the fire. Trompadics. When Henry VI inherited the throne, the kingdom should have been stable. Unfortunately, Henry wasn't exactly the warrior king type. He was gentle, pious, and famously indecisive. Some days he was perfectly normal, other days he wouldn't speak at all, lost in a haze that doctors of the time called madness. Not ideal when your job is to rule England. While the king drifted between lucidity and silence, the kingdom began to crumble. Nobles fought for influence like vultures circling a sleeping lion. The Queen Margaret of Anjou took charge, bold, intelligent, and unafraid to crush her enemies. But her enemies were many, and one of them had an especially sharp sword. Richard, Duke of York. Richard wasn't just another noble, he was the descendant of Edward III's 4th son, which gave him a stronger claim to the throne than Henry, in some people's eyes. And in a world where bloodlines meant everything, that was enough to turn allies into enemies overnight. He wasn't openly rebelling, not yet, but his ambition was an open secret. Meanwhile, England itself was worn out. The 100 Years' War against France had drained the treasury dry. Soldiers came home poor, villages were burned, and trade had slowed to a crawl. Taxes rose, tempers flared, and hungry peasants whispered that maybe the king had lost God's favor. When the economy suffers, people look for someone to blame, and the royal family was a big, shiny target. By the late 1450s, the kingdom was like a pot left too long on the fire. Steam hissed beneath the lid, and everyone could hear the bubbling tension. Margaret gathered the Lancastrians to protect her husband and son, while Richard built his army of Yorkists, claiming he just wanted to advise the king. Sure, Richard, and I only go to the bakery to look around. And so England stood on the edge of a storm. No one could have imagined the decades of bloodshed that were about to follow. The Wars of the Roses would tear the country apart, ruin noble families, and change the monarchy forever. For now, though, it was just whispers, alliances, and the uneasy calm before everything went up in flames. England had known weak kings before, but none quite like Henry VI. He had been crowned as a baby, a tiny, wide-eyed child who grew up surrounded by men who used his name to gain power. By the time he was old enough to rule, the country was tired, poor, and unsure of its future. Henry tried to be a man of peace, but the crown on his head was heavier than his heart could bear. But ruling a kingdom isn't like running a church. The nobles wanted a warrior king, not a saint. While France mocked him and England's debts piled high, Henry spent his days praying for peace. Unfortunately, his prayers went unanswered. Then came the whispers. The king is not well. Some days Henry would stare into the distance and say nothing for hours. Physicians tried every remedy they could think of, potions, bloodletting, even prayers, but the madness would come and go like fog rolling through the countryside. In the silence left by his illness, Queen Margaret of Anjou stepped forward. Fierce and fearless, she took control where her husband could not. Many loved her for her strength, but many more feared her temper. To some nobles, she was a foreigner meddling in English affairs. To others, she was the only thing keeping the kingdom from falling apart. But in the shadows of that same court stood a man who saw England's weakness as his moment to act. Richard, Duke of York. Calm, proud, and intelligent, He had royal blood that traced back to Edward III's fourth son, and in a kingdom ruled by a broken king, that made him dangerous. Richard had served as regent before, ruling in Henry's name when the king was too sick to govern. The country had flourished under his steady hand, laws enforced, roads repaired, soldiers paid. But when Henry recovered, Margaret made sure Richard was pushed aside. She didn't trust him, and she was right not to. Ronso, the Queen, surrounded the king with her loyal supporters, especially Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, a man Richard openly despised. To Richard, Somerset represented everything wrong with England: corruption, favouritism, and weakness disguised as loyalty. Tension filled every corner of court life, smiles in public, daggers in private. Then, in 1453, the king broke completely. The news from France was terrible. England had lost almost all her lands there. As the defeat sank in, Henry collapsed into silence. For over a year, he didn't speak, didn't move, didn't react. The throne sat occupied but empty, and while the country waited for their king to wake, the kingdom began to rot. With the king gone in body and mind, Richard was recalled to lead once more. Parliament named him protector of the realm, and for a moment England breathed easier. Order returned, but Richard's enemies, and the Queen herself, saw what this meant. If he could rule in Henry's place, maybe he could rule instead of Henry. The idea hung in the air like thunder before a storm. When Henry finally recovered, he found a realm that had thrived without him, and a wife who wanted her power back. Richard was dismissed, the Queen's allies returned, and the whispers began to turn into open talk of war. The lines were being drawn: the red rose of Lancaster, the white rose of York. England's family feud was no longer a secret, it was destiny. The air in May 1455 was heavy with tension. For years England's nobility had traded insults, schemes, and letters sealed with wax and venom. But now, words had run out. The red rose and the white were finally about to draw swords. In the market town of St. Albans, just north of London, the first battle of the Wars of the Roses was about to begin. Small in scale, but monumental in meaning. The Lancastrian army, led by Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, stood ready to defend the king's honour. But defence was only part of the story. These men wanted Richard of York gone, erased from politics, maybe even from life. They surrounded King Henry VI like a human shield, convinced that war would prove their loyalty. Opposite them marched the Yorkist army, led by Richard, Duke of York, and his fiery ally Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the man history would later call the Kingmaker. Though outnumbered, their troops were disciplined and determined. For the first time, Englishmen looked across a battlefield and saw fellow countrymen, cousins, and even brothers staring back. It should have been a meeting for peace. Letters had been exchanged, negotiations were promised. But when Richard arrived at St. Albans and saw the barricades blocking his path, he realised there would be no talking today. The Lancastrians had fortified the streets, turning the quaint market town into a trap. At around mid-morning, the silence broke, Yorkist trumpets blared, and arrows sliced through the mist. The first battle of the Wars of the Roses had begun. The streets of St. Albans exploded with chaos. Armoured men crashing into each other between market stalls and thatched roofs, the cries of the wounded echoing through cobblestone alleys. The fighting was brief but brutal. Within half an hour the Yorkists broke through. Warwick's men stormed the centre of the town, cutting down anyone in red livery. The Duke of Somerset, Richard's old rival, was found hiding in an inn. He fought fiercely but was struck down beneath the sign of the Castle Tavern. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. By noon the battle was over. The streets of St. Albans were littered with bodies, noblemen and commoners alike. King Henry VI had been wounded by an arrow, though only lightly. When York found him in a nearby house, he knelt and assured him that no harm was meant. It was a curious kind of rebellion, one that apologised for winning. York's victory was total. Somerset was dead, Northumberland was dead, and the Queen's faction was shattered. But what seemed like peace was only a pause. York had shown England that he could raise an army and defeat the king's loyalists in open combat and get away with it. The message was clear: the crown was no longer untouchable. The king was escorted back to London under York's supervision. In public, they smiled and rode side by side, pretending the kingdom was at peace again. But everyone could feel it. Something had broken. The nobles whispered that the Roses had drawn first blood. There would be truces and treaties ahead, yes, but the wound would never close. For now, England exhaled. The streets were quiet again. The church bells rang as if to cleanse the blood from the air, but in manors and castles across the country, letters were already being written. Letters calling men to arms. The storm had only begun, and England's roses were still growing, watered by the blood of St. Albans. The Battle of St. Albans had ended, but peace did not follow. It never really does. England's fields were quiet again, yet beneath the silence, fear took root. The blood spilled that day had soaked too deep into the soil to wash away. The nobles returned to their manners, pretending things were normal. But everyone knew something in England had cracked. Conning Henry VI was technically still on the throne, but that didn't mean he was ruling. He was more like a figurehead, calm, polite, and often confused. His mind wandered like a candle in the wind. Sometimes he'd talk about peace as if war had never happened. Other times he stared into the distance for hours, lost in a fog no one could enter. That left the real power in the hands of whoever could control the king, and that was a dangerous game. Richard of York had proven himself capable, but Queen Margaret of Anjou was still alive, furious and gathering loyalists. Two powers now circled the throne like wolves, one with royal blood, the other with royal marriage. York tried to keep things peaceful. He acted humble, polite, even loyal, but behind every smile lay calculation. He knew Margaret would never forgive him for killing her allies at St. Albans, and she knew that if Richard ever made one more bold move, it could mean the end of her husband's dynasty. The whole court became a play with too many actors and only one crown. Meanwhile, the nobles picked sides. Some wore red roses on their tunics, others pinned white. Feasts became quiet, tense affairs where every toast felt like a threat. No one trusted anyone. The country wasn't at war, but it wasn't at peace either, just trapped in a long, anxious pause before the next strike. Outside the palaces, the common people felt the chill too. Merchants whispered about new taxes. Farmers worried their sons would be called to fight again. Even the churches grew divided, some priests praying for York, others for Lancaster. It was as if the whole kingdom had forgotten how to breathe. Then came the Loverday of 1458. In a strange attempt at unity, the king ordered his feuding nobles to literally hold hands and walk together through London as a show of peace. And so they did. Richard of York, Queen Margaret, and all the lords of England, parading down the streets arm in arm like actors in a bad play. The people cheered, but no one believed it. That same night, many of those same nobles went home and began raising armies again. Letters were sent in secret, riders galloping through the countryside with wax-sealed messages promising loyalty or vengeance. England was trying to look calm, but it was shaking beneath the surface. By 1459, everyone could see the truth. The peace had failed. Margaret gathered her forces in the north, while York prepared his allies in the south. The question was no longer if war would return, it was when. In the taverns, people whispered, "The roses will bloom again," and this time they would not wilt so easily. Ron desited of culture at balance on a knife's edge, too proud to forgive, too wounded to heal. The crown rested on a fragile king, guarded by a furious queen, and stalked by an ambitious cousin. It was not yet the storm, but the air was heavy with it. The kingdom had no stability left, only fear, waiting for its next chapter. Snow fell thick and heavy that March morning in 1461, blanketing the Yorkshire countryside like a burial shroud. The world looked peaceful, quiet, as if it didn't yet know that by day's end, tens of thousands would lie dead beneath that same snow. This was Towton, and it would become the bloodiest day in English history. The war had flared up again after years of broken truces. The Lancastrians, still loyal to King Henry VI and Queen Margaret, gathered their forces in the north. The Yorkists, led by young Edward, Earl of March, marched north to meet them. Edward had recently claimed the crown, calling himself King Edward IV. Towton would decide if that crown stayed on his head or rolled in the snow. The two armies faced each other across a wide open field, near a small stream called Cockbeck. The snowstorm blew fiercely, stinging eyes and numbing hands. But there was a twist of fate. The wind blew directly into the faces of the Lancastrians, driving snow and sleet against them. The Yorkist archers grinned. God, it seemed, had chosen a side. Rancotes Forshlow. The Yorkists let loose the first flight of arrows, thousands whistling through the snow, invisible until they struck. The Lancastrians fired back, but their arrows fell short, buried harmlessly in the mud and snow. The Yorkists retrieved them, grinning, and sent them flying back again. It was a deadly joke of the wind. One side's curse became the other's weapon. Ranco, when the archers ran out of arrows, the real horror began. Swords were drawn, axes lifted, and men charged through knee-deep snow. The field became a storm of steel and screams. The frozen ground turned slick with blood, and soldiers slipped as they fought, cutting friend and foe alike. The snow that had been white at dawn was crimson by noon. The Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, fought beside Edward, rallying the troops with cries of vengeance. Across the field, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, led the Lancastrians with equal fury. The battle swayed back and forth like a pendulum of death. No banners stayed upright for long. They fell and rose again, drenched in snow and blood. Then came the turning point. Edward ordered his hidden reserve, fresh troops waiting behind the ridge, to charge. They hit the Lancastrian flank like a hammer through glass. The enemy line broke and panic spread. Men screamed, dropped their weapons and fled. But there was nowhere to run, only the icy river ahead. Thousands tried to cross the frozen stream at Cockbeck, but the ice shattered beneath their weight. Armor dragged men under, swords and shields sank beside them, the water ran red. The Yorkists showed no mercy, not after years of betrayal and blood. Those who reached the far bank were cut down where they stood. When it was over, the dead were everywhere, an ocean of silence and snow. Chroniclers later claimed 28,000 men died that day. No one could count for sure. The survivors said that when spring came and the snow melted, the water in the streams ran red for weeks. Towton wasn't just a battle, it was a cleansing by fire and frost. Eínwon de Betthorth was victorious. The crown was his, not by inheritance but by the sword. Henry VI and Queen Margaret fled north, defeated but not destroyed. For the moment, the White Rose ruled England, but as history would soon learn, in this family feud, no victory ever lasted long. Peace, once again, would be only a pause. After Towton, the snow melted into spring, and Edward IV rode into London as England's new king. He was young, tall, and confident, a soldier who had taken the crown by force and charm in equal measure. The people loved him, the nobles feared him, and for the first time in years, it felt like England might finally rest. Edward wasn't like Henry VI. He wasn't timid or lost in prayer. He was bold, handsome, and fond of good food, fine clothes, and the company of beautiful women. He ruled with confidence, sometimes too much confidence. But after years of war and madness, the country seemed willing to forgive a few royal parties. The Earl of Warwick, the powerful noble who had helped Edward win the crown, became his closest ally, or so he thought. Warwick was called the Kingmaker for a reason. He had put Edward on the throne, and now expected to rule beside him. But Edward was no puppet, and that would soon cause trouble. Warwick dreamed of an alliance with France, a royal marriage that would cement Edward's power across Europe. He negotiated for Edward to marry a French princess. But when Warwick returned home to announce the match, he discovered that Edward had already married someone else, in secret. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and a widow whose family had once fought for the Lancastrians. The court was stunned. Warwick was furious. The marriage wasn't just romantic, it was political suicide. By marrying for love, Edward had insulted France, betrayed his ally, and enraged half his own nobility. Still, Edward's charm carried him through the scandal. He filled his court with Elizabeth's family, the Woodvilles, giving them titles, lands, and influence. To Warwick and the old nobles, it felt like a takeover by strangers. They began to whisper that Edward had forgotten who helped him rise. Beyond the palace walls, Edward's reign brought a fragile calm. Trade returned. London bustled with merchants and laughter. The wounds of war began to heal, at least on the surface. But peace built on wounded pride never lasts long. Warwick began plotting. If he had made one king, he could make another. By 1469, rebellion flared again. Uprisings in the north claimed to fight against royal corruption, but everyone knew who stood behind them. Warwick had switched sides. The man who made Edward king was now determined to destroy him. Brother turned on brother. Ally turned into enemy. The old curse of the roses had returned. Warwick captured Edward, a king taken prisoner by his own mentor. For a brief moment, it seemed the crown might change hands again. But Edward escaped, charming his guards and slipping away to rally loyal soldiers. The young king wasn't ready to give up his throne or his pride. The peace was gone. The betrayal was complete. England was once again a kingdom divided, brother against brother, rose against rose. Edward's reign had begun in triumph, but it would soon drown in blood and revenge. The White Rose would not rest quietly. Loyalty in England had become a rare thing. Once Richard Neville, the powerful Earl of Warwick, had been Edward IV's greatest ally, the man who helped him win the throne. Now he was his most dangerous enemy. Betrayal doesn't come from strangers, it comes from friends who know where you keep your crown. It didn't happen all at once. Warwick had swallowed insult after insult, the secret marriage, the Woodville's rise, the loss of his influence. Each slight was a stone added to the pile until it crushed the friendship completely. By 1469, Warwick had convinced himself he was the real protector of England, and that Edward had become proud, reckless, and unworthy. His first move came quietly. Rebellions broke out across northern England, spontaneous, the rumours said. But behind every uprising there were Warwick's gold coins and Warwick's letters. The Kingmaker had begun to unmake his own creation. In one of history's cruel jokes, Warwick even turned Edward's own brother against him, George, Duke of Clarence. George was ambitious, jealous, and easy to manipulate. Warwick promised him the throne if Edward fell. The brothers smiled for portraits but plotted for crowns. On 1469, Warwick's forces defeated Edward's army and captured the king himself. For a few surreal weeks, England was ruled without its monarch. The kingmaker was in charge, but he soon realized that ruling a country wasn't as simple as controlling a battlefield. The nobles refused to obey him, and the people demanded their king. Power, it turned out, was easier to seize than to hold. On Andre, Edward escaped. Some said it was cleverness, others said bribery, but either way, the young king vanished into the night and rode for safety. Warwick's plans unravelled. By spring, Edward returned with fresh troops and reclaimed London, smiling as if betrayal were just a brief inconvenience. Cornered and humiliated, Warwick fled overseas, but exile only sharpened his resolve. In France he found an unlikely ally, the very woman he had once fought to destroy, Queen Margaret of Anjou. Once enemies, they now shared a common goal, the downfall of Edward IV. On Andre the kingmaker and the queen plotted to restore the mad King Henry VI to the throne. For a man once hailed as the power behind York, Warwick now marched under the Red Rose of Lancaster. It was treason dressed as redemption. On 1470, Warwick invaded England again. This time fortune favoured him. Edward's support crumbled, and the people, weary of taxes and wars, did not resist. London opened its gates. King Henry VI, frail, confused and harmless, was pulled from the Tower and placed back on the throne. For the moment, the Red Rose had bloomed again, but power built on revenge never lasts. Even as Henry sat once more upon his throne, Edward gathered his strength in exile, waiting for the right moment to return. The wheel of fortune turned again, slow and relentless, and far from England's shores, the White Rose began to stir beneath the frost. Exile had taught Edward IV many lessons: patience, humility, and the taste of revenge. While Warwick the Kingmaker and Queen Margaret celebrated their victory in England, Edward waited across the Channel in Burgundy, sharpening his plans. The Red Rose ruled again, but the White one was not dead. It was merely waiting for spring. England, meanwhile, was restless. The return of Henry VI brought no joy, only confusion. The old king was gentle but lost in thought, often unaware of where he was or who sat beside him. The nobles whispered that England had no true ruler, only ghosts wearing crowns. The kingdom that Warwick had restored was already beginning to crumble. In early 1471, Edward saw his moment. With a small band of loyal men and Burgundian gold, he set sail from France under grey skies. His enemies laughed, the mighty king returning with barely 1,000 men, but Edward had something they didn't: the hearts of soldiers who had followed him before, and the courage to risk everything again. When Edward landed at Ravenspur, he didn't claim to be king. Not yet. He said he only wanted his dukedom back, a clever lie to win passage through unfriendly lands. But as he marched south, more men joined him. Villages opened their gates. By the time he reached York, his small band had become an army. The man who once built kings now found one coming for him. He sent messages to gather forces and called for the help of his new allies, the Lancastrians, but England's loyalty was already shifting again. The tide had turned. In April 1471, the two armies met at Barnet, just north of London. A thick fog covered the battlefield. No one could see more than a few yards ahead. Men fought in confusion, shouting names they couldn't see, striking down allies by mistake. It was chaos, a battlefield swallowed by smoke and fear. Bronze through the haze, Warwick himself charged into the fight, sword gleaming. He was fearless, as always, perhaps too fearless. As the fog lifted with the morning sun, his banner fell. The kingmaker lay dead, struck down by the very forces he had once created. The man who made kings had finally met his own unmaking. Inside the tower, Henry VI sat quietly, murmuring prayers, unaware that his world had ended again. The White Rose had returned, and this time Edward meant to keep his throne. No more truces, no more mercy. But there was one final reckoning. Queen Margaret herself landed in England with fresh troops, bringing her teenage son, Prince Edward of Lancaster, to fight for their claim. They met Edward IV's army at Tewkesbury. The battle was swift and brutal. The Lancastrians were crushed, and the young prince, the last hope of Henry's line, was slain on the field. Not long after, Henry VI was found dead in the Tower. The official story said melancholy took him, but few believed it. With Warwick gone and the Lancastrians destroyed, Edward IV's power was absolute. England was quiet again. But quiet in England never lasted long. The war had ended, or so everyone thought. When the dust settled after Tewkesbury, Edward IV was once again King of England. Undisputed, unchallenged and unopposed. The wars were over, or so people whispered. The Red Rose was buried, the White one triumphant. London celebrated. Banners flew and the bells rang loud enough to drown out the memories of war. But peace built on graves never lasts. For a while the kingdom did heal, trade returned to the markets, harvests filled the barns, and children were born into a world that finally felt safe. Edward ruled with steady hands, part soldier, part showman. He was England's first truly modern king, more interested in wealth, diplomacy, and image than endless battlefields. But inside the palace, the calm began to crack. Edward's brothers, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had helped him win the throne. They had bled for him, but now they wanted rewards worthy of kings, and Edward, for all his charm, didn't like sharing power. Clarence in particular grew restless. He had betrayed Edward once before when he sided with Warwick, and though forgiven, he never truly forgot the thrill of power. He drank too much, complained too loudly, and spread dangerous rumors that maybe he, not Edward, was the rightful king. He dabbled in plots, conspiracies, and witchcraft, or so the rumors went. Whether true or not, the king had enough. In 1478, George, Duke of Clarence, was arrested for treason. His death became one of the strangest in English history. Some said he was quietly executed. Others claimed he was drowned in a barrel of wine. Poetic justice for a man who loved drink more than wisdom. Whatever the truth, Clarence's death cast a dark shadow over the royal family. The York dynasty was winning, but it was devouring itself. Ronric Richard, Duke of Gloucester, remained loyal, or appeared to. Quiet, efficient, and watchful, Richard became Edward's most trusted lieutenant. He kept order in the north and rarely smiled, earning a reputation for both discipline and mystery. No one knew what thoughts hid behind those calm grey eyes. Ronrut. For a few peaceful years, England prospered. Edward's court glittered with wealth, feasts, music, and laughter. The king grew older, heavier, more indulgent, but his health began to fade. Too much wine, too many late nights, too much comfort. The man who once charged through battlefields now struggled to climb stairs. In 1483, death finally came for Edward. England mourned, genuinely this time. For all his flaws, he had brought stability to a kingdom long torn apart. But his heir, Prince Edward, was only 12 years old, and power, as always, hates a vacuum. The peace Edward had built began to crumble the moment his heart stopped beating. As the king's body lay in state, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, quietly stepped forward. He was the boy's uncle, the one everyone trusted to keep the throne safe until the young king came of age. But England had seen this story before. In a kingdom built on ambition and betrayal, protector was just another word for next in line. When Edward IV died in the spring of 1483, England wept, but not for long. The kingdom didn't stay peaceful when kings died. It never did. His son, Prince Edward, was only 12 years old, and far too young to rule alone. The boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stepped forward to serve as protector of the realm. At least that's what everyone believed at first. But along the way, Richard intercepted him. He bowed politely, spoke softly, and took command of the royal escort for the prince's safety, he said. It was the kind of safety that comes with chains you can't see. By the time they reached London, everything had changed. Richard dismissed the boy's protectors, arrested his allies, and quietly delayed the coronation. The prince and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, were taken to the Tower of London, officially to await the ceremony. But behind the stone walls, the echoes of ambition grew louder than the church bells. Soon after, rumours began to spread. The marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, the boy's parents, was declared invalid, which meant the princes were now illegitimate, and illegitimate sons couldn't inherit the throne. Parliament agreed. In a stunning twist, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III. The two boys remained in the tower, their laughter fading from the corridors. They played in the gardens, read their lessons, and waited for the day their uncle would set them free. But the day never came. One by one, their servants were dismissed. Their rooms grew quieter. Then one night the windows went dark, and stayed that way. Weeks passed. People whispered in taverns and churches, "Where are the princes?" Some said they were moved to another castle. Others said they were dead, smothered in their sleep by order of the king. But no one knew for sure. The tower kept its secrets well. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, fled into sanctuary, terrified for her remaining children. The once proud queen now lived like a prisoner in a church, clutching her younger daughters and praying that rumours were only rumours. But deep down she must have known. In England, power had a habit of devouring innocence. Years passed, and the truth never surfaced. The princes were never seen again. Some claimed the guards buried them beneath the staircase. Others swore they escaped, hidden by secret allies. Their story became legend, a whisper of guilt that followed Richard III wherever he went. Richard ruled, but not comfortably. The crown he'd taken by force, sat heavy on his head. Every smile in court hid suspicion. Every banquet was silent. The people respected him, but they did not love him. You can't build loyalty on fear, and England had learned that lesson too many times. To this day, no one truly knows what happened to the princes in the tower. Maybe they were murdered. Maybe they vanished into exile. Maybe their ghosts still wander those cold halls, waiting for a truth that history never gave them. Whatever the answer, England had lost its innocence, and the crown had gained another curse. After the disappearance of the princes, Richard III stood alone on England's throne, powerful yet utterly isolated. To the people, he was a mystery. Brilliant administrator, ruthless usurper, loyal brother, or cold-blooded murderer. No one could quite decide. What was certain was this: England's newest king had inherited more ghosts than allies. Richard was not the monster later legends would make him. He was small, yes, and carried one shoulder higher than the other. But he was sharp, efficient, and brave. He reformed laws, punished corruption, and cared for the poor more than most kings dared to. Yet none of it mattered. The whispers about the princes were louder than his good deeds. Still, Richard pressed on. He toured the realm, granting pardons, listening to petitions, and trying to prove he was England's rightful ruler. For a brief moment, it almost worked. The markets thrived again, the nobles stayed quiet, and even his enemies admitted that Richard ruled with discipline. But peace born of fear never lasts, especially when hope sails on the wind. Across the sea, in the quiet courts of France, another claimant stirred. Henry Tudor, a thin, patient man with a distant claim to the throne through his mother's Lancastrian blood. He had been in exile for years, watching, waiting, and now, with Richard's name cursed by rumour and rebellion, Henry saw his chance. Richard, meanwhile, faced betrayals closer to home. The nobles who had once sworn loyalty began shifting their eyes toward Tudor. Even the Stanleys, one of England's most powerful families, kept their loyalty ambiguous. To Richard, every smile looked like a trap, every oath sounded like a lie, and perhaps by then it was. Richard gathered his forces and rode out to meet him. He was 32 years old, still strong, still fierce, and still determined to prove that destiny could be defied. For Richard, this was not just a battle, it was redemption written in blood. He made camp near the small Leicestershire village of Bosworth. His army was larger, his knights more experienced, but in war, numbers don't always decide the victor, loyalty does. And Richard's army was full of men whose loyalty had already been bought or broken. As dawn broke on August 27th, 1485, Richard rode into battle shouting, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." Not as a coward, but as a man fighting to the last breath. He charged directly at Henry himself, cutting through his guard with terrifying skill. For a moment, victory seemed certain. Then the Stanleys turned their troops, and England turned with them. When the dust cleared, Richard III lay dead among his fallen knights, the last English king to die in battle. His crown was found lodged in a thorn bush and carried to Henry Tudor. The white rose had wilted, and a new dynasty, the Tudors, began to bloom. History would remember Richard III as the crooked king, a villain with a twisted spine and darker soul, but perhaps he was just a man crushed by the weight of ambition, guilt, and rumour. Whether monster or martyr, one thing was certain. With his fall, the Wars of the Roses finally came to an end. The red and the white had bled into one. The morning of August 26, 1485, began with fog. Thick, grey and silent, it rolled across the fields near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. The dew clung to grass like tears. Two armies waited, one for power, the other for survival. On one side stood King Richard III, armoured and proud. On the other, Henry Tudor, the exile who had come home to take a crown. Richard's men numbered nearly 10,000, seasoned soldiers hardened by years of war. Henry's army was half that size, a patchwork of mercenaries, Welsh longbowmen, and desperate exiles. But numbers mean little when hearts are uncertain. Many of Richard's nobles, especially the powerful Stanley family, had not yet decided which flag to follow. As the sun rose, the fog began to lift. The clang of armour echoed, birds scattered, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. Richard rode among his men, shouting courage into their tired hearts. "God and St. George," he cried, "we fight for England and for our rightful crown." For all his doubts, he still believed destiny favoured the bold. Ron Holtz. Henry Tudor, in contrast, said little. He was no warrior king, more strategist than swordsman. He stayed close to his commanders, letting his uncle Jasper Tudor and the experienced John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, lead the charge. His calmness wasn't confidence, it was survival. Every battle he'd ever fought had been with fate stacked against him. The fighting began mid-morning. Oxford's archers loosed the first volley, blackening the sky with arrows. Richard's cannons thundered back, shaking the fields. Men shouted prayers, charged and disappeared into smoke. The Battle of Bosworth had begun, not just a fight for England, but for the soul of a nation that had bled for 30 years. At first, Richard's lines held strong. His armoured knights pushed forward, forcing Henry's men to retreat toward a marshy hollow. But the Stanleys, watching from the hill, did not move. They waited, unmoved, calculating which king would survive the morning. In war, timing is everything, and betrayal is just another form of patience. Richard saw Henry across the field, small, surrounded by guards, vulnerable. In that instant, the king made a choice that would define his legend. He spurred his horse forward and charged straight toward his rival, cutting through the melee like a storm of steel. It was madness and brilliance in equal measure. He reached Henry's guard and broke through, striking down banner-bearers and bodyguards one after another. For a moment the crown itself seemed within his grasp, but fate, cruel as ever, intervened. The Stanleys finally moved, and they moved against him. Their fresh troops crashed into Richard's flank, surrounding him on all sides. Richard fought like a man possessed. Witnesses said he refused to flee, cutting down opponents until his sword snapped. Surrounded and bleeding, he roared one last time, "Treason, treason," before being struck down. The last true Plantagenet king died in the mud, crownless but unbroken. When the battle ended, silence swept the field. Richard's body was stripped and carried to Leicester, thrown over a horse like a common criminal. His crown, found tangled in a thorn bush, was placed upon Henry Tudor's head. The Wars of the Roses were over, the red and white united, at last, beneath a single name, Tudor. The battlefield of Bosworth still smelled of smoke when Henry Tudor was crowned right there in the open field. Mud still wet beneath his boots, clouds parting as if the sky itself were relieved. He had come from exile, from obscurity, from nothing, to become King Henry VII of England. And for the first time in 30 years the war was over. Henry's crown didn't rest easy on his head. He had won by blood, not by birth. His claim to the throne was thin, a branch grown from the furthest corner of the royal family tree. But he was clever. He didn't try to erase the past. Instead, he decided to heal it. His first act as king was not vengeance, but union. In 1486, Henry married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and sister to the lost princes. With that union, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were joined into one, the Tudor rose. It was more than a marriage, it was a symbol that the feud was finished, the wounds finally bound. Their coronation feast was unlike any in memory, not loud with laughter, but gentle and solemn, as if England itself was learning how to breathe again. The nobles who had once fought on opposite sides now sat side by side, raising cups to peace. Behind every smile, however, lingered the ghosts of the past. Henry ruled differently from the kings before him. He trusted no one completely, not even his friends. He built a kingdom on order and accounting, coins over crowns, numbers over names. The wars had shown him what chaos cost, and he meant never to let it return. England's sword was sheathed, but its purse was guarded tightly. The new king began to rebuild. Roads repaired, ports reopened, and trade flourished. Foreign merchants once again trusted English coins. Peace, like a nervous animal, crept back into the kingdom. And though Henry ruled with a cautious hand, he brought something England had not felt in decades: stability. Yet even in peace, shadows lingered. Pretenders appeared. Men claiming to be one of the lost princes returned from the dead. One was called Lambert Simnel, another Perkin Warbeck. Both were used by enemies of the Tudors to test the king's nerve. Henry dealt with them quietly but firmly. The age of mercy was over. The age of order had begun. Queen Elizabeth brought warmth to the new dynasty. She was graceful, kind, and beloved by the people. Together they raised sons and daughters, a new generation untouched by war. When their firstborn Prince Arthur was baptized, the church bells of England rang as if the nation itself was finally exhaling after decades of fear. Still, Henry's eyes were always on the horizon. He knew peace was fragile. His spies watched the nobles. His tax collectors watched the people. To some he seemed cold, a king who smiled rarely and forgave slowly. But perhaps that was the price of peace. He had seen too many kings die from trusting too easily. By the time Henry grew old, the memory of war had begun to fade. Children played beneath banners that once divided their ancestors. The red and white roses bloomed side by side. For the first time in living memory, England was whole, not perfect, not pure, but finally, peacefully whole. And as Henry closed his eyes for the last time, he left behind not a battlefield, but a kingdom ready for rebirth. The battlefield of Bosworth still smelled of smoke when Henry Tudor was crowned right there in the open field. Mud still wet beneath his boots, clouds parting as if the sky itself were relieved. He had come from exile, from obscurity, from nothing, to become King Henry VII of England. And for the first time in 30 years, the war was over. Henry's crown didn't rest easy on his head. He had won by blood, not by birth. His claim to the throne was thin, a branch grown from the furthest corner of the royal family tree. But he was clever. He didn't try to erase the past. Instead, he decided to heal it. His first act as king was not vengeance, but union. In 1486, Henry married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and sister to the lost princes. With that union, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were joined into one, the Tudor rose. It was more than a marriage, it was a symbol that the feud was finished, the wounds finally bound. Their coronation feast was unlike any in memory, not loud with laughter, but gentle and solemn, as if England itself was learning how to breathe again. The nobles who had once fought on opposite sides now sat side by side, raising cups to peace. Behind every smile, however, lingered the ghosts of the past. Henry ruled differently from the kings before him. He trusted no one completely, not even his friends. He built a kingdom on order and accounting, coins over crowns, numbers over names. The wars had shown him what chaos cost, and he meant never to let it return. England's sword was sheathed, but its purse was guarded tightly. The new king began to rebuild. Roads repaired, ports reopened, and trade flourished. Foreign merchants once again trusted English coins. Peace, like a nervous animal, crept back into the kingdom. And though Henry ruled with a cautious hand, he brought something England had not felt in decades: stability. Yet even in peace, shadows lingered. Pretenders appeared. Men claiming to be one of the lost princes returned from the dead. One was called Lambert Simnel, another Perkin Warbeck. Both were used by enemies of the Tudors to test the king's nerve. Henry dealt with them quietly but firmly. The age of mercy was over. The age of order had begun. Queen Elizabeth brought warmth to the new dynasty. She was graceful, kind, and beloved by the people. Together they raised sons and daughters, a new generation untouched by war. When their firstborn Prince Arthur was baptized, the church bells of England rang as if the nation itself was finally exhaling after decades of fear. Still, Henry's eyes were always on the horizon. He knew peace was fragile. His spies watched the nobles. His tax collectors watched the people. To some he seemed cold, a king who smiled rarely and forgave slowly. But perhaps that was the price of peace. He had seen too many kings die from trusting too easily. By the time Henry grew old, the memory of war had begun to fade. Children played beneath banners that once divided their ancestors. The red and white roses bloomed side by side. For the first time in living memory, England was whole, not perfect, not pure, but finally, peacefully whole. And as Henry closed his eyes for the last time, he left behind not a battlefield, but a kingdom ready for rebirth. The Wars of the Roses ended not with a roar, but with a whisper. The swords were sheathed, the banners folded, and the dead left to sleep beneath English soil. But though the war was over, the memory of it refused to rest. England, it seemed, had fallen in love with its own tragedy. In taverns and castles alike, people retold the stories of kings and cousins, betrayals and beheadings. Each retelling made the war a little more dramatic, a little more poetic, until fact and legend blurred into one. Heroes became villains, villains became ghosts, and the truth somewhere in between quietly disappeared. The new Tudor rulers understood the power of stories. Henry VII and his son Henry VIII made sure history remembered their victory as destiny, not luck, not betrayal, but divine justice. The Tudors didn't just unite England, they rewrote it, and their favourite villain was the man they had replaced, Richard III. Poor Richard. In life he had been complicated, brave, intelligent, suspicious and ruthless when cornered. In death he became a monster. His back grew more crooked in the stories, his heart more twisted in the plays. The Tudors needed a villain to make their dynasty look noble. Richard fit the part perfectly. And then, a century later, a playwright named William Shakespeare gave Richard his final, eternal form. In his play Richard III, the king became a hunchbacked demon, charming but cruel, clever but doomed. His every line dripped with poison and poetry. The world cheered as he fell, and few cared whether the real Richard ever deserved it. From then on, history became theatre. The red rose and the white were no longer political symbols. They became emblems of romance and tragedy. Painful history softened into poetry. England's bloodiest family feud became the world's favourite story of power, pride and fate. In truth, there were no heroes in the Wars of the Roses, only survivors. Every king lost something, a son, a throne, or his sanity. Every victory was short-lived. And yet, from all that chaos, a new England was born, leaner, wiser, and ready for the dawn of a new age. Centuries later, When archaeologists found Richard III's skeleton buried beneath a parking lot in Leicester, the nation paused. The old king, once painted as a monster, turned out to be small, frail, and very human. His spine was curved, yes, but his story and England's had bent even more over time. Perhaps that is the real legacy of the roses, not the blood or the crowns, but the stories. They remind us that history isn't written by the victors alone, it's rewritten, repainted, and reimagined by everyone who tells it. The truth may lie buried, but the echoes remain, and so the roses still bloom, red and white, side by side in gardens across England. Once they marked division, now they mark peace. Their petals fall silently, carried by the same wind that once blew across battlefields. Time, it seems, heals even the wounds of kings. The Wars of the Roses had ended, but their shadows stretched long across England. What rose from that blood and ruin was something new, a country reborn. The Tudors, born from both red and white, built a kingdom stronger than either house alone. Out of chaos came unity. Out of tragedy came rebirth. Henry VII ruled not as a warrior but as a builder. He restored the treasury, ended feudal armies, and replaced swords with law. For centuries nobles had fought for the throne. Now there would be one crown, one monarch, one England. The age of barons was over. The age of kings had begun. Under the Tudors, England began to change, slowly at first like a kingdom waking from a long sleep. Roads were repaired, trade blossomed, and foreign diplomats arrived once more at the royal court. The island that had torn itself apart was learning how to stand tall again. Henry's son, Henry VIII, would inherit that peace, and then test it. Ambitious, fiery, and restless, he would turn England's eyes away from civil war, and towards something far greater: empire, reform, and the reshaping of faith itself. The Tudors weren't just survivors of history, they were its architects. The centuries of bloodshed had taught England a brutal lesson, that power divided is power destroyed. The Tudors built their rule around that truth. No more warring cousins, no more rival roses. Every noble now served one throne, one voice, one destiny. The kingdom became a single beating heart, but it wasn't only politics that changed. It was the people. Commoners began to dream beyond survival. Merchants became rich, scholars became influential, and artists began to paint the stories of kings not as propaganda, but as legacy. The wars had ended, but the story of England had just begun to sing. It was a promise. A reminder that peace was possible, but only if England remembered what it had lost to gain it. It bloomed on coins, on castle gates, even on the ceilings of cathedrals, beauty grown from blood. As years passed, the memories of the Wars of the Roses faded into legend. Shakespeare turned them into plays, poets turned them into parables, and England itself turned them into lessons. Every generation looked back and whispered the same truth: division destroys, unity endures. By the time the Tudors gave way to new dynasties, England was no longer the fragile kingdom it once had been. It was an island of ambition, ready to explore, to conquer, to create. The wars had broken it, but in breaking, they had also made it unshakable. The storm had forged steel, and so ends the tale of the Roses, a story of family and fury, of love and betrayal, of kings and ghosts. It is a story England still carries in its heart, written in every rose that blooms on its soil. For though centuries have passed, one truth remains: peace is never given, it is built, petal by petal, life by life, generation by generation.